Today's video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. Look, are you a fan of military-themed strategy games? I've been a fan of those. I think I got into them with Red Alert 2 or Age of Empires 2, one of those, like back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Look, if you like the idea of taking control of a real country and leading it to victory against other players in real-time battles, well, Conflict of Nations is for you. This free online PvP strategy game lets you choose your own strategy and build your own army using tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, and more. You can fight up to 128 players in real-time battles that can take weeks to complete. And one of the best things is you can play on your PC or on your phone. I like the long-term strategy aspect of this game. It's not just about winning a battle, it's about winning a war. You have to carefully manage and develop your nation by researching new units and building the required infrastructure. And forming alliances with other players is also an essential part of the game, which is fun. And you can get 13,000 gold and a month of premium subscription for free by clicking the link in the description below. But don't wait too long because this offer is only available for 30 days. So check out Conflict of Nations through the link below, and now today's video. Humans aren't good at being alone. In fact, we find it so uncomfortable that when researchers left people alone in a room for 12 minutes with nothing but an electroshock device, 25% of women and a staggering 70% of men chose to electrocute themselves rather than just sit with their own thoughts. We don't usually realize how much we need human contact until we're deprived of it. This was beautifully illustrated by a team of Antarctic researchers who were out staring at flowers after a long winter away. Suddenly, one noticed a woman pushing a stroller and yelled, "Baby!" The whole team rushed across the road to look at it, and the woman turned and fled in terror. Unfortunately, isolation causes more than just an awkward loss of social norms. It's damaging. It can trigger hallucinations, extreme aggression, depression, panic attacks, and even a reduction in gray matter. In a shocking case, in 2009, American Sarah Short was hiking between Iraq and Iran when she was taken into custody and thrown into solitary confinement. One day, she heard screaming coming from down the hall, and guards rushed to her cell. It took her a moment to realize, but she was the one who was screaming. She looked around, and the walls were smeared with blood from where she'd been pounding her fists. Heartbreakingly, her story isn't unique, and tens of thousands of prisoners are currently in solitary confinement worldwide. A practice that isn't just distressing for them, it's causing parts of their brains to shrink. Yes, you can survive isolation, but you won't come out with the same brain that you went in with. If you're a human who likes other humans and you've spent a bit of time alone, you might have experienced cabin fever, or what most people describe as a craving for human interaction. Until recently, this was explained away as a general wish to do something enjoyable, but a recent failed experiment has revealed that our desire for social connection is much deeper than that. Dr. Gillian Matthews was investigating the effects of drug addiction on the connection between neurons in the part of the brain called the dorsal raphe nucleus, the DRN. Her experiment involved two groups of mice, the control group who were injected with saline and the test group who were injected with cocaine. The idea was that the DRN connections would differ between the groups, but frustratingly, they grew stronger in both. At first, this didn't make any sense, but then she realized it had nothing to do with the cocaine. The mice were developing new neural connections in response to the 24-hour isolation period each had endured before their injections. Essentially, she was seeing loneliness. Seeing the importance of her discovery, she abandoned her drug research and joined Kay Tai, a neuroscientist and pioneer of optogenics. This is a technique that uses genetically engineered proteins and fiber optic cables to switch on or off neurons in live animals. To apply this to Matthews' hypothesis, they isolated mice and observed their desire for social interaction. Then they suppressed the DRN neurons, and as if by magic, the mice lost interest in returning to their friends. It was like an on-off switch for loneliness. But did it apply to humans? Obviously, we can't go around switching off parts of people's brains with fiber optics to test it out, but in 2020, MIT neuroscientist Livia Tomova devised a study that could answer the question in a less invasive way. She assembled a group of volunteers and deprived them of both social interaction and food for 10 hours. When their time was up, she took an MRI scan of their brains and they were shown various pictures, including of food and social cues. Both caused the volunteers' brains to light up in the same way, in a part of the brain rich in dopamine neurons. They were craving a conversation in the same way they were a burger. They were hungry for it. This was groundbreaking, as it demonstrated that human contact is more than something we want to do, it's a fundamental need which is hardwired into our brains. We have mechanisms in place that drive us to fulfill that need, just like we do for food and water. And we're rewarded with a rush of dopamine when we get it. The flip side of the coin is that if you don't provide your body with the things it's requesting, that excited craving can turn into something negative, stressful, and ultimately damaging. One of the most shocking impacts of isolation is that it can shrink the brain, specifically the region known as the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, spatial orientation, and the regulation of emotions. This was demonstrated in one study of a 9-person crew at the Newmar 3 research station in Antarctica. Before their expedition began, each crew member received a brain scan and blood tests. And after 14 months of near isolation, they were tested again. Scans revealed each person's hippocampus had shrunk by an average of 7%, and blood levels of brain-deprived neurotrophic factor, the protein responsible for promoting the growth of nerve cells and synapses, had plummeted by 45%. Unsurprisingly, all crew members performed more poorly in selective attention and spatial awareness tests than they had before their expedition. Even more concerningly, they still hadn't recovered 1.5 months later. Another concerning discovery is that social isolation can cause enough damage that it increases your chances of developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease. A large study of 800 elderly patients in the US produced the most terrifying results. They found that over a 4-year period, the people who identified themselves as lonely or isolated were twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's. A UK study of nearly 500,000 people with an average age of 57 backed this up. Researchers discovered that people who were socially isolated, meaning they lived alone and participated in social activities less than once a week, had reduced cognition, poor memories, slower reaction times, and startlingly, lower volumes of grey matter. Not just in the hippocampus, but also in the frontal and temporal lobes. After 12 years, participants were revisited and found to have a 26% increased chance of developing dementia. The reasons why isolation causes this are yet to be fully understood, but one theory is that it's simply down to a lack of use. Studies have found that a taxi driver's hippocampus will increase in size as they memorize destinations and routes. So it makes sense that the brain would lose volume when it's not utilized. Think about all the ways that you use your brain when interacting with others: language, attention, memory, and analysis of social cues. It's all a workout for your hippocampus, and if you don't use it, you lose it. A widely used movie and TV trope regarding the effects of social isolation is aggression. Jack Nicholson hacking his way through a door with an axe is perhaps the first that will spring to mind, but you could also cite pretty much any Lost in Space type pilot. Almost all of them peak with the protagonist coming across a lone survivor whose first response is to brutally murder their rescuer. But is there any science behind it? Unfortunately, yes, and it's partly down to the tachykinin gene and a neuropeptide called neurokinin B. Researchers first saw the effects in Drosophila flies. Social isolation triggered an increase in these neuropeptides and made the fruit flies unusually aggressive. They then managed to replicate the same response in mammals. First, they isolated some mice, which made them stressed, scared, and angry. They then used drugs to chemically block the neurokinin B receptors in different regions of their brains. The results were incredible. When they applied the suppressor to the amygdala, the mice lost their fear. When they applied it to the hippocampus, they lost their aggression. This was targeted treatment for mental illness, a vast improvement on the brain-wide side effect-inducing serotonin and dopamine treatments currently used for humans. Unfortunately, the effects of isolation don't just stop at your brain. When you're denied social interaction, you experience stress, just like you would if you couldn't access food or water. This causes adrenal glands to reduce more cortisol, the stress hormone which increases blood pressure, heart rate, and inflammation. This can result in cardiac issues, and one study found that isolation increases the risk of heart disease by 29% and stroke by 32%. It can also make you more susceptible to succumbing to other diseases. For example, in 2006, a study involving 2,800 women with breast cancer found that those who spent little time with friends or family were 5 times more likely to die than their more sociable counterparts. Another study done with heart failure patients concluded that socially isolated patients had a 3.7 times higher risk of death. In total, long-term isolation will make you 26% more likely to die prematurely. This stress can also make you irritable, which is one of the key challenges that needs to be overcome when considering space travel. To assess the scale of the problem, researchers have conducted extensive simulations where small groups are isolated for up to 2 years. One such test resulted in 2 crew members giving each other the silent treatment for 18 months. Which is pretty impressive when you only have 4 other people to talk to. Don't worry though, scientists think they've cracked it with the invention of an AI-driven crew interactive mobile companion known as Simon. This is designed to cheer astronauts up and mediate crew disputes. They've even included a not at all punchable friendly animated face. So that'll probably stop anyone snapping and murdering their crewmates. Maybe. By far the most dramatic effects of social isolation have been demonstrated by those unfortunate enough to experience solitary confinement. And in some cases, people have even been mad enough to submit themselves to it voluntarily. In 2017, Channel 5 conducted a TV experiment which involved locking up volunteers in porta cabins for 5 days. One willing participant was a single mother who just wanted some time alone. But the experience wasn't quite as restful as she imagined when, after only 72 hours, she began vomiting, hallucinating, and talking to her own hands. In 2018, poker player Rich Alati bet a fellow player $100,000 that he could spend 30 days in total isolation. After just 3 days, he started seeing white balls floating around the room, and after 20, negotiated a payout of $64,400 to allow him to leave. Social isolation is also frequently associated with seeing ghosts or experiencing sensed presence. This is where they don't actually see anything, but are keenly aware of someone standing beside them. In one incident, Joshua Slocum, the first person to complete a solo circumnavigation of the globe in a sailboat, was convinced that the ghost of one of Christopher Columbus's long-dead crew members took control of his ship during a storm. Something similar happened when Frank Smythe attempted to climb Everest alone. He was so convinced that the sensed presence following him down the mountain was a real person that he started offering it food. And so he returned from his trip with an imaginary friend who liked cake. Tragically, almost half of all widows in the USA report hallucinating their deceased spouses, and their visions often lasted many years. Due to the distressing effects and potential for long-term damage, the UN considers solitary confinement of more than 15 days torture. Their Mandela rules state that it can be used for short periods in prisons and jails, but only as a last resort. It's a practice that has drifted in and out of fashion in the United States. In 1829, solitary confinement was considered humane, meditative, and practically therapeutic, so much so that it spawned the Philadelphia Prison, an institution designed to reform prisoners with quiet reflection in solitary cells. A mercy compared to the more punitive prisons of the time. However, when Charles Dickens visited in 1842, he saw something very different, describing one prisoner as a more dejected, broken-hearted, wretched creature it would be difficult to imagine, and another who would stare at his hands and pick the flesh open using the fingers. Eventually, authorities realized that rather than reforming prisoners, solitary was driving them deep into mental illness. And researchers concluded it was unnatural to leave men in solitary day after day, year after year. Indeed, it was so unnatural that it bred insanity. In 1890, a Supreme Court case deemed that the month a death row prisoner had spent in solitary was such a severe punishment for murdering his wife that he was not only let off of his execution, but was even released. During the case, the court heard a considerable number of the prisoners fell, after even a short confinement, into a semi-fatuous condition from which it was next to impossible to arouse them, and others became violently insane. Others still committed suicide, while those who stood the ordeal better were not generally reformed, and in most cases did not recover sufficient mental activity to be of any subsequent service to the community. Unfortunately, collective memory is short, so solitary confinement has experienced a resurgence. In 2010, Anthony Graves was released from prison after spending 18 years on death row and 10 in solitary for a crime that he didn't commit. He later recounted what he saw there. "I would watch guys come to prison totally sane, and in 3 years they don't live in the real world anymore." He also described a fellow inmate who would go out into the recreation yard, get naked, lie down, and urinate all over himself. He would take his feces and smear it all over his face. 10 years after his release, Graves still suffered mood swings, sleep disturbances, and emotional breakdowns as a result of his decade in isolation. So solitary doesn't work in prisons. But due to a lack of adequate monitoring and reporting, the Mandela rules are frequently disregarded, and on any given day in America, you can find around 60,000 people who've spent the last 15 days in solitary confinement. It currently accounts for between 6 and 8% of the US prison population, but tragically, 50% of deaths by suicide. One of the most extreme examples of solitary confinement is that of Robert King. He was initially sent to prison in 1969 for a robbery that he denies committing. Then he was falsely accused of murdering a fellow inmate and sent to solitary for the next 29 years. To stay sane, he developed a few hobbies. When he could trade for enough ingredients, he'd manufacture praline candies by melting sugar in half a drinks can, heated by burning toilet paper. When he could, he'd smuggle them out. He also created a chessboard on his floor by sticking down squares of toilet paper with toothpaste. Then he'd call out the moves to fellow inmates. After his release, the true impact of his years in the cell became clear. He suffers from vision impairment, is unable to see long distances, and he can't recognize faces. When asked how he didn't go insane, he replied, "I did not tell you I was not insane. I don't mean I was psychotic or anything like that, but being placed in a 6x9 by 12-foot cell for 23 hours a day, no matter how you appear on the outside, you are not sane." So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Just a reminder here at the end that it's brought to you by Conflict of Nations. If you're ready to dive into the action and experience the excitement of this strategic game for yourself, head on over to the link in the description below and start playing today. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.